The bomber shook like a living thing as the flak found their altitude. Aluminum skin rang and flexed. Dust drifted from the overhead ribs, and someone in the waist blurted a half-finished curse that cracked into the interphone as static. 4 engines droned in a tireless, heavy rhythm that you felt more than heard, a steady vibration through the floor and into the soles of your boots. Outside the tiny plexiglass windows, the sky above southern Europe was bright and cold, streaked with white contrails and pocked with black blossoms of exploding shells. Inside this B-17 of the 15th Air Force, there were 10 men, each with his own world of fear and habit. The pilot hunched forward, one hand on the yoke, the other flicking quickly between throttle levers and trim wheels. The co-pilot called out minor changes in heading from the navigator, his voice a little too loud on the interphone, a nervous habit he no longer noticed. Behind them, the bombardier watched the target growing in the glass nose, a sprawl of factories and marshalling yards far below, framed by dark hills and a river that glinted in the winter sun. They had been over enemy territory for hours now, flying from a strip carved out of Italian farmland, across the Adriatic, over the jagged white teeth of the Alps, and down into the industrial heartland of the Reich. The cold in the unheated fuselage cut straight through sheepskin and wool. Oxygen masks smelled of rubber and stale breath. Guns jutted from every other opening in the fuselage, and the men behind them shifted, craned, and scanned the sky in every direction, eyes watering in the frigid air. Then the first call came from the tail. "Bandits! 6 o'clock high! Lots of them! Looks like 109s!" The word snapped through the crew like an electric shock. The tail gunner's voice was tight and high, the way it got when he was really scared, not just pretending. The top turret began to swivel, bearings grinding, as the flight engineer searched the blue haze behind the bomber stream. The waist gunners kicked aside ammo cans and clambered fully into their positions, fingers already on the butterfly triggers. They had seen it before. German fighters streaking in from the sun or boiling out of clouds, twin-engine Zersterer raking the formation with cannon fire, single-engined Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs darting between the bombers like wolves around a herd. When they came in close, the men could see the yellow noses or black crosses, sometimes even the white scarf of a pilot whipping in the slipstream. But you rarely had time to think about that. You simply fired and prayed. "Jesus, where are our escorts?" the navigator muttered, more to himself than to the interphone. Far ahead, at the front of the great box of bombers, a few specks were already peeling away from the high cover position. The German fighters were setting up for a classic head-on pass, a wall of flashing wings rushing straight toward the bombers. The flak eased a little as the guns on the ground tried not to hit their own pilots. For the men inside the flying fortress, it felt like standing on a railway track, watching a train hurtle toward them at closing speed. The pilot keyed his mic. "Any little friends up there today, boys? We could use some company." The answer came in a calm, clipped voice from somewhere up and to the side, through the same crackling ether that carried weather reports and recalled childhood songs. "Red lead to bomber formation. We have you in sight. Stay tight. We are with you." They saw them then. At first they were just specks, dark against the sun. Then the sun caught them, and the aluminum flashed, and the details resolved. Sleek, laminar-winged fighters sliding in from above and to the side, leveling off just ahead of the lead box of B-17s. Air-swept canopies, four-bladed props, coolant radiators under the chin. P-51 Mustangs, the long-legged escort fighter that had changed the balance of the air war. What the bomber crews noticed first, though, were the tails. The vertical fins were painted a deep, unmistakable red. In the clear air, they looked almost luminous, like lacquered metal. The fighters banked as they took their covering positions, one flight sliding in between the squadrons of bombers, and another pair of flights cruising higher into the flanks, and that flash of color ran down the formation, a red streak against the dull olive and gray. Someone in the radio room let out a breath he had been holding since the tail gunner's first call. "Red tails," he said. "We got the red tails today." In bomber messes from Foggia to Puglia, a quiet superstition had grown up around those crimson fins. Crews who had flown with them swore the odds were better. Rumor became lore. Some bombardment groups began to ask specifically for those escorts when operations assigned fighters to their missions. Red tails meant discipline. Red tails meant that when the German fighters came, the escorts would not dart off in pursuit and leave the heavy bombers alone. The red tails stayed. The pilots flying those Mustangs were members of the 332nd Fighter Group, better known simply as the Tuskegee Airmen. They were the first black fighter pilots in the United States Army Air Forces. Their presence in that sky was the result of years of political struggle, bitter prejudice, and relentless training. Their record would make them some of the most respected bomber crews ever had, even as many of their fellow citizens doubted that they belonged in the cockpit at all. To understand how those red tails came to be in the sky that day, you have to step back to an America that did not believe they should exist. Long before the war, the official position of the Army was that black Americans were fit only for limited roles in uniform, usually as laborers or in segregated support units. A 1925 Army War College report had gone so far as to argue that black soldiers lacked the emotional stability and courage for complex combat roles, including flying. This pseudoscience seeped into doctrine, into personnel charts, into the quiet assumptions of bureaucrats. It was recited whenever the question arose of whether African Americans might serve as pilots.
Outside the War Department, the country was changing. The Great Migration was reshaping cities, and black newspapers such as the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender demanded that military service match the rhetoric of democracy. Civil rights leaders like A. Philip Randolph and organizations like the NAACP recognized that aviation was more than technology. Flight had become a symbol of modernity and mastery, of national prestige. If black citizens were excluded from the air, they would be kept symbolically on the ground. When war loomed in Europe, pressure increased. President Franklin Roosevelt's administration, wary of political fallout, sought a compromise. The Army Air Corps would open a pilot training program for black volunteers, but it would be segregated and treated as an experiment. If it failed, the failure could be blamed on the supposed limitations of the trainees rather than the system that prepared them. If it succeeded, it would have to succeed spectacularly to be accepted. The location chosen for this new program was in the Deep South, at Tuskegee, Alabama. There, an existing black educational institution, Tuskegee Institute, had already established a civilian pilot training program and built an airfield, Moton Field. Nearby, the Army built a new facility, Tuskegee Airmen Airfield, where military flight training could be conducted. In July 1941, the first class of black aviation cadets began training there.
13 young men stepping into a program surrounded by equal parts curiosity and hostility. Only 5 of that first class would eventually earn their wings, including a quiet, serious West Point graduate named Benjamin Oliver Davis, Jr. On the ground, Tuskegee did not look like much. A few runways cut into the red Alabama soil, rows of wooden barracks and tin-roofed hangars. The heat in summer rose off the tarmac in shimmering waves. In winter, the humidity cut to the bone. But for the cadets who arrived there, many of them having worked their way through civilian pilot training programs or college ROTC units, it was a doorway into the sky. A typical day began before dawn. Reveille snapped through the cool darkness, and the barracks filled with the smell of shaving cream and wool. The men dressed in khaki and polished boots, their movements already shaped by an awareness that someone was always watching. Morning formation led to physical training, then to mess hall breakfasts eaten quickly under the eyes of instructors. Afterward came ground school, navigation, meteorology, aircraft recognition, the intricacies of engines and propellers. Instructors drove them hard, hammering home every concept with the blunt insistence that any mistake at 20,000 feet could become a coffin. Flight training came in stages, first in simple primary trainers, then in slightly more complex basic trainers, finally in advanced aircraft that resembled the fighters they hoped to fly in combat. The first time a cadet soloed, lifting off alone, the landscape falling away, the little trainer suddenly more alive and more fragile than it had ever seemed with an instructor aboard, was a moment of private triumph. But even that joy contained a sharper edge at Tuskegee. Compared to white cadets at other airfields, the men here knew that every check ride, every landing, every minor slip would be judged more harshly. The program was under a magnifying glass. The scrutiny was not only technical. Some officers in the chain of command wanted the Tuskegee experiment to fail. Elimination rates were high. Rumors circulated among cadets that a single training accident might be seized upon as proof that blacks could not safely fly fighters. The result was a constant grinding pressure to be not simply good, but better than good. Cadets kept their uniforms immaculate, their barracks spotless. In the flight line, they walked taller than they felt, aware that enlisted black ground crews, white visiting officers, and local townspeople were all drawing conclusions from their behavior. Outside the airfield, the world remained Jim Crow, Alabama. Black pilots who would one day lead formations of fighters over Europe could not sit where they wished on buses. They used segregated facilities. They risked insult or worse if they stepped out of line. On base, there were separate mess halls and clubs. The contradiction was obvious to everyone who lived it. Cadets wrote home about it in carefully worded letters, conscious of the censors. In private, among trusted friends, they joked darkly that the Army wanted them to fight for democracy in places whose names they could barely pronounce, while denying them its simplest forms in the state where they trained. Amidst this atmosphere of tension and determination, a few figures stood out. One was a civilian instructor named Charles Alfred Chief Anderson, a self-taught pilot who had earned his license before most airlines would hire black aviators. Anderson had an easy, confident style in the cockpit and a firm belief that his students were capable of anything the machines required of them. In 1941, when First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt visited Tuskegee, she insisted on flying with Anderson. Her public endorsement, captured in photographs of the white First Lady smiling beside a black pilot in a small airplane, gave the program a measure of political protection and helped undercut claims that black pilots could not be trusted in the air. Another central figure was Benjamin Oliver Davis, Jr., who had arrived at West Point in 1932 as the only black cadet in his class. For 4 years, his white classmates had maintained a deliberate silence around him. They didn't speak to him except on official duty. They did not room with him. They hoped to push him out. Instead, he endured, graduating in 1936 and beginning a career in an army that still had no place for a black pilot. When the Tuskegee program opened, Davis was assigned to the first pilot training class and quickly became its senior officer. His sense of duty, sharpened on the gray Hudson River plain at West Point, met the expectations of Tuskegee like flint to steel. The young men around him read him carefully. He rarely raised his voice. He demanded meticulous discipline and professionalism. He understood that any lapse could feed the prejudices of those who wanted them grounded. Yet he was not distant. In the evenings, he would sometimes walk the line of barracks, stopping to speak quietly with a cadet who had struggled that day in the air, or with a mechanic who had stayed late to coax a bulky engine back into life. His leadership model was simple. They would prove themselves, not through rhetoric, but through performance. The first unit to emerge from Tuskegee into combat was the 99th Fighter Squadron. Activated in early 1942, the squadron trained under Davis and his cadre through that year, learning to fight in Curtiss P-40 Warhawks. The P-40 was no longer the cutting edge of fighter design, but it was rugged and familiar. The men practiced air-to-air gunnery over the Alabama fields, strafed mock targets, and flew endless formation drills. For many, the moment when orders finally came to deploy overseas felt like the real test. They would have to carry the weight of every argument that had been made about them into actual battle. In the spring of 1943, the 99th sailed for North Africa. The desert airfields on the Tunisian coast were dusty and improvised, a scatter of tents, pierced steel planking, and revetments scraped out of the sand. The men of the 99th were attached to white fighter groups. Their initial missions involved escorting medium bombers and attacking ground targets. On June 2, 1943, the squadron flew its first combat sortie, providing air cover during the bombardment of the Italian-held island of Pantelleria. They returned without loss, exhilarated and exhausted. Over the following months, they flew in support of the invasion of Sicily and the grinding campaign on the Italian mainland. Performance in war, however, did not automatically dissolve prejudice. In 1943 and 1944, some senior officers in the Army Air Forces criticized the 99th as ineffective, using selective statistics and ignoring the context in which the squadron operated. A report recommended pulling the unit out of combat altogether. The implication was clear. The Tuskegee experiment had failed. Davis, then a lieutenant colonel, flew back to Washington to defend his men. He spoke before a War Department committee, laying out mission histories and kill claims in cool detail. He argued that the 99th's performance was comparable to any new units, and that to judge them unfairly because of their race would be both unjust and militarily foolish. While the debate raged, the 99th kept flying. In January 1944, during the Allied landings at Anzio, its pilots shot down multiple German aircraft over 2 days, helping shield vulnerable landing craft and troops from attack. Their kill tally, combined with the broader record, undercut claims of incompetence. The War Department, under scrutiny from black newspapers and civil rights organizations, allowed the unit to remain in combat. The 99th had passed its first great trial, but their story was only part of what the Tuskegee Airmen would become. By late 1943, the Army Air Forces had authorized a larger all-black fighter group, the 332nd.
It would eventually consist of 4 squadrons, the 99th, 100th, 301st, and 302nd. The group trained at Selfridge Field in Michigan and other northern bases, where the men encountered a different style of segregation. In some nearby towns, they were barred from restaurants or theaters. On base, white officers' clubs refused black officers, despite Army regulations. Tensions occasionally flared into confrontations. Yet in the air, the training followed the same syllabus as any other fighter group, and under Davis's command, the group sharpened itself for a very specific role. By early 1944, the strategic bombing campaign against Germany had reached a crisis. Heavy bombers flying from England and Italy were suffering unsustainable losses when they penetrated deep into enemy territory without adequate escort. The introduction of long-range fighters like the P-51 Mustang promised to change that. In the Mediterranean theater, the 15th Air Force, operating from Italy, needed more escort units for its B-17 and B-24 groups. The 332nd Fighter Group, with its growing combat experience and Davis's reputation, was assigned to that task. The group moved to Italy in the spring of 1944, eventually basing at Ramatelli, a rough airfield near the Adriatic coast. There, black pilots in leather jackets and crushed caps walked across the same mud as white bomber crews, but their living areas and mess facilities remained segregated. From Ramatelli, the 332nd flew missions in P-47 Thunderbolts at first, then converted to the sleeker, faster P-51 Mustang. It was during this period that the group adopted the distinctive paint scheme that would become their emblem: red tails. In many fighter units, painting aircraft tails or noses in vivid colors was a practical measure that also served morale. It made it easier for formation leaders and bomber crews to recognize their escorts in the chaos of a combat box. For the 332nd, red tail fins, red wingtips, and occasionally red spinners became both a tactical marker and a symbol. In the clear Italian light, a formation of their Mustangs was instantly recognizable. Bomber crews who saw them sliding into position began to refer to them as the Red Tails, or, more poetically, the Red-Tailed Angels. The mission the 332nd received from 15th Air Force Headquarters was simple in wording and ruthless in demands. They were to escort heavy bombers to and from targets deep in enemy territory, protecting them from enemy fighters. They might also be called upon to strafe enemy airfields or rail yards, but their first priority was the safety of the bombers. Colonel Davis grasped the importance of that priority instantly. In some fighter groups, aggressive pilots approached escort duty as a chance to hunt. When German fighters appeared, they would sometimes leave the bomber formations to pursue them, chasing kills and glory away from the main body of bombers. This could lead to impressive individual tallies, but it left the heavy bombers more exposed. Davis issued a standing order to his men. They were not to leave the bombers. If enemy fighters attacked, they would meet them in close, then return to position. They would not roam. The phrase his pilots remembered was stark. He told them, "Stay with the bombers. Your job is to get those boys home." It was not a glamorous philosophy. Some young fighter pilots chafed at it. They were, after all, trained to tangle with the enemy, to measure themselves against the Luftwaffe. But Davis explained that in this war, in this theater, the bombers were the main weapon. Without them, oil refineries, rail junctions, and factories in the Reich would continue to feed Hitler's armies. Their worth would be judged not only by how many enemy planes they destroyed, but by how many bomber crews returned to base after a mission. On a clear June morning in 1944, that doctrine was tested on one of the 332nd's first major escort missions for the 15th Air Force. The target was Munich,
a city deep in Germany, ringed with flak defenses and within reach of numerous fighter bases. The bombers lumbered north from Italy, engines humming, contrails merging into ragged lanes behind them. In the cockpits of the P-51s, Tuskegee pilots sat in cramped seats, harnesses tight, eyes constantly moving. One of them, a composite of many men who flew that day, might have been a lieutenant from Philadelphia or Birmingham, hands gloved against the chill, a photograph of his wife or sweetheart taped near the instruments. He listened to the bomber chatter on the radio, the terse exchanges between lead aircraft. Ahead, the Alps rose like frozen waves, their snowfields bright and deceptive. Below, the Rhine and Danube round like silver threads. As they neared the target, German fighters appeared. They came in as dark flecks against the high haze, then as darting shapes that turned abruptly into the bomber stream. The Tuskegee pilots rolled into them, throttles forward, guns armed. Tracers arced and curved through the sky. A B-17 took a burst in its wing and began to lag. Two red-tailed Mustangs slid back to bracket it, placing themselves between the wounded bomber and the incoming fighters. In the chaos of the fight, Davis, leading his group, kept one eye on the bombers and one on the swirling dogfights. He called out short commands, repositioning flights to plug gaps in the escort screen. When the German fighters finally broke off, leaving a trail of smoke and debris, the bombers pressed on to the target and then turned for home. Years later, Davis would receive the Distinguished Flying Cross for his leadership on that mission, cited for his skill in disposing his squadrons so that the bomber formation suffered only minimal losses. Over the months that followed, the 332nd flew mission after mission. They escorted bombers to oil refineries at Ploesti in Romania, to marshalling yards in Vienna and Budapest, to industrial targets in Czechoslovakia and southern Germany. They covered reconnaissance planes and transport aircraft. They burned fuel in hour-long climbs to freezing altitudes and then rode the great steel rivers of bombers across enemy territory. The conditions inside the Mustangs were as harsh as in the bombers, if not more so. There was no space to move, no other crewman to share a joke with over the interphone. A fighter pilot flew alone, with only the engine's vibration, the twitch of control surfaces, and the occasional clipped voice on the radio for company. On a long mission, fatigue wore at him like sandpaper. The oxygen mask chafed his face, and his eyes ached from constant scanning. Yet discipline remained. When enemy fighters appeared, the Red Tails engaged, then slid back into position around the bombers like a shield closing. Statistics would later tell one part of the story. From mid-1944 through the end of the war, the 332nd flew 179 bomber escort missions for the 15th Air Force. On only a handful of those missions did enemy fighters manage to shoot down bombers under their protection, with a total of 27 lost. Other P-51 groups in the same theater experienced significantly higher bomber loss rates, averaging around 46. For decades, a popular legend would claim that the Tuskegee Airmen had never lost a single bomber, a myth born from wartime press reports and pride. Later archival research corrected the record, but the core truth remained. Compared to most escort units, the Red Tails were remarkably effective at their mission. Behind those numbers were days like July 18, 1944. On that date, B-17s of the 483rd Bombardment Group, escorted by the 332nd, were dispatched to attack targets in Hungary. The Luftwaffe responded in force, throwing as many as 300 fighters into the attack.
They came from above and behind, diving through the bomber formations, then climbing to set up new passes. The sky filled with crossing contrails and bursts of flak, with falling debris and twisting, diving aircraft. Tuskegee pilots met them head-on. Some throttled up to intercept the initial wave, their Mustangs shuddering as they fired short, disciplined bursts. Others flew close cover, staying tight to the bombers as they rolled and yawed to avoid attacks. In the melee, 15 American bombers went down, a terrible loss that shook the crews and command alike. But those who survived remembered seeing red tails streaking past, pursuing attackers just long enough to break up their runs before snapping back into escort positions. One bomber pilot from that mission would later recall that as his crippled B-17 slipped out of formation with an engine on fire, a pair of red-tailed Mustangs slid into place beside him and stayed there for miles, shepherding his plane away from the worst of the attacks. He watched one of them peel off finally to engage a German fighter that had slashed in, saw a brief flare of tracers as the Mustang rolled, and then lost sight of it in cloud. Many such moments went unrecorded, existing only in the private memories of men who had long since grown old. Escort duty did not keep the Tuskegee Airmen away from ground attack missions. On some days, after seeing their bombers safely through flak belts and fighter zones, red-tail pilots were cleared to descend and look for targets of opportunity. They strafed trains, convoys, airfields, barges on rivers. On one mission in the Adriatic, Tuskegee pilots attacked and helped sink a German destroyer, hammering it with repeated gun runs until it rolled and slipped beneath the waves. For those men, watching the enemy warship burn and list, there was a fierce satisfaction in putting their firepower against a symbol of Axis might. From the bomber crew's perspective, the red tails became a familiar and welcome sight. A crewman in a B-24 might wake before dawn on an Italian airfield, choke down powdered eggs, pull on heavy gear, and trudge to his aircraft. As he climbed aboard, he would glance automatically toward the fighter line. If he saw Mustangs with red tails warming up in the distance, he might feel his shoulders loosen a fraction. Word spread informally. Debriefings after missions included questions about escort performance. Crews who had flown with other fighter groups compared experiences. Stories circulated about escorts who had chased kills and left bombers exposed, or who had been late to rendezvous. Against that backdrop, the Tuskegee Airmen's reputation for staying with the bombers stood out. Bomber crews began to request the red tails. In operations rooms, where staff officers juggled unit availability and maintenance schedules, pilots would lean over the desk after a briefing and ask quietly whether the 332nd would be up with them that day. Some remembered them affectionately as the colored boys from Alabama, others simply as the Red Tails. Over time, a nickname took hold that blended gratitude with a touch of poetry. To men encased in aluminum, riding through flak, those flashes of color circling them in the bright, brutal sky looked like something almost supernatural. They called them red-tailed angels. Respect in combat did not automatically translate to equality on the ground. In Italy, as in the United States, military facilities were run along segregated lines. Black officers of the 332nd sometimes found themselves barred from white officers' clubs even when they shared the same airfields. They might return from a mission on which they had risked or lost their lives to protect crews housed a few hundred yards away, only to be reminded on a posted sign that certain spaces were not for them.
The contrast with civilian Italians was striking. Many local villagers, hardened by years of war, hunger, and occupation, had little interest in American racial categories. To a farmer watching from a field, a P-51 was a P-51. Its pilot, a foreigner, who might toss candy to children or share rations. Tuskegee Airmen sometimes found that they were welcomed into Italian homes, where their uniform, not their skin color, defined them. Then they would return to base and be confronted by rules telling them which entrances to use, which counters to approach. Far from the front, another group of Tuskegee Airmen was grappling with segregation in a different way. The 477th Bombardment Group, an all-black medium bomber unit training on B-25 Mitchells in the United States, never got the chance to see combat before the war ended. They fought a different sort of battle, against discrimination inside the Army itself. In the spring of 1945, at Freeman Field in Indiana, black officers of the 477th attempted to enter a white officers' club in defiance of base regulations that imposed separate facilities. Over 100 were arrested in what became known as the Freeman Field Mutiny. Their peaceful protest and the eventual overturning of most charges against them would later be recognized as an important early step in the broader civil rights movement and in the fight to desegregate the armed forces. Back in Europe, the red tails kept flying as the war ground toward its end. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was a diminished force, worn down by attrition, fuel shortages, and the destruction of its training infrastructure. Yet, it could still be deadly. On some missions, only a handful of German fighters appeared, probing, testing, then fading away. On others, particularly where vital oil or transportation targets were at stake, they attacked with desperate ferocity. Even when enemy fighters were scarce, flak remained. German and Italian anti-aircraft gunners had spent years refining their techniques. They knew the altitudes at which bombers liked to fly, the likely headings, the choke points where formations had to pass. They coordinated belts of fire that seemed at times to hang motionless in the air, waiting for an aircraft to fly into them. Tuskegee pilots were not immune. A hit that a B-17 might limp home with could tear a single-seat fighter apart. Losses accumulated quietly. A pilot failed to return, and his bunk remained made up, his locker untouched. Someone gathered his few personal possessions, a photograph, a Bible, a pair of gloves, and placed them in a box. Letters went out to families in Chicago, Georgia, New York, Mississippi. By war's end, at least 66 Tuskegee Airmen had died in combat, and many more in accidents or from other causes related to their service. The scale of what the Tuskegee Airmen accomplished grew clearer as their wartime record was compiled. In total, 992 men completed the Advanced Pilot Training Program at Tuskegee and earned their wings. Of those, about 355 deployed overseas as fighter pilots in the Mediterranean theater. From 1943 to 1945, units associated with the Tuskegee program flew over 15,000 sorties and more than 1,500 missions for the 12th and 15th Air Forces. The 332nd Fighter Group alone flew the 179 heavy bomber escort missions that had made their name among bomber crews. Combined, Tuskegee pilots were credited with more than 100 aerial victories, the destruction or damage of hundreds of enemy vehicles and installations on the ground, and participation in the sinking of a German destroyer. They also paid a price in wounds, death, and the strain of carrying their double burden. Every pilot who strapped into a red-tailed Mustang confronted the same risks as any other Allied fighter pilot: enemy fire, mechanical failure, weather, the ever-present possibility of flak shrapnel at 20,000 feet. On top of that was the knowledge that his mistakes might be used to judge not only him, but the ability of an entire race to serve in combat roles. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, celebrations rippled through bases from Ramitelli to the training fields in Alabama. Pilots who had been flying combat missions days earlier found themselves suddenly idle, their departure dates uncertain. Some were rotated home quickly. Others remained overseas for months, waiting for transport ships or new assignments. As news of Hiroshima and Nagasaki came in August, and then of Japan's surrender, it became clear that their services as combat pilots would not be needed in the Pacific. Returning home, Tuskegee Airmen encountered a country still marked by the same racial lines they had left behind. A pilot in crisp uniform stepping off a train in Georgia might be refused service at a lunch counter. A decorated officer in California might be told to move to the back of a bus. GI Bill benefits that promised education and home loans to veterans were often administered by local officials who steered black applicants away from colleges and neighborhoods open to whites. The contradiction stung. Men who had led formations into flak and fought the Luftwaffe were expected to slip quietly back into second-class citizenship. Some did what they could to push back. They joined veterans organizations, spoke at schools, wrote letters to newspapers. Others returned to civilian professions and built lives around family and work, carrying their wartime experiences as private, complex memories. Among the institutions forced to confront change was the United States military itself. The performance of black units in World War II, including the Tuskegee Airmen, provided powerful evidence against arguments that integration would harm efficiency. Reports on the 32nd's combat record, including its bomber escort effectiveness, circulated in staff studies. The Freeman Field Mutiny and similar protests underscored that segregation was not simply an abstract policy, but a source of real tension and injustice.
In 1948, President Harry S. Truman issued Executive Order 9981, directing the armed forces to desegregate and to ensure equal treatment and opportunity for all service members regardless of race. The Air Force, created as a separate service in 1947, moved more quickly than some branches to integrate its units. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who had begun the war leading a single segregated fighter squadron, helped draft the Air Force's integration plan. The Red Tails, as a distinct unit, would fade into history, their pilots reassigned across the service, but their influence would echo in every integrated cockpit and crew room that followed. Yet statistics and policies capture only part of the legacy. For the men who flew in those bombers, the memory of Red Tails was visceral. Decades after the war, in quiet conversations, at reunions, or in taped interviews, some described the way their hearts lifted when they saw the crimson fins sliding into view. They remembered watching P-51s make head-on passes at German fighters, guns flickering, then rocketing past, trailing smoke. They remembered returning to base to find a hole in a wing, a shredded control surface, a shredded nerve, and knowing that somewhere above them during that mission, Tuskegee pilots had been making calculations and choices that might have saved their lives. The Tuskegee Airmen carried their own memories. A fragment of a bomber's wing spinning past, an enemy fighter tumbling, the flat black bursts of flak over Vienna or Munich, the sight of a parachute opening below, white and small against dark earth, the sound of a friend's voice on the radio breaking into static, the quiet in a barracks where a bunk would never again be occupied. For all of them, the war became a shared geography of sky and fear and trust. In that world, the color of a man's skin receded behind the color of an airplane's tail, the position of his aircraft in the formation, the steadiness of his hand on the controls. Imagine again that bomber we met at the beginning, droning across enemy territory, flak bursting around it like malignant flowers. The tail gunner calls out incoming fighters. The pilot's hands tighten on the yoke. Then, out of the corner of his eye, the bombardier sees a flicker of red sliding into the field of view. One, then another, then a line of P-51s, their tails shining, moving with practiced, purposeful grace.
"Red tails," someone says on the interphone, with a grin that can be heard even through the oxygen mask. "Looks like we might make it home after all." In that small moment, with oil-streaked windows and numb fingers and the taste of fear in the back of the throat, the abstract debates of generals and politicians become something simple. These fighters, flown by men whose right to be there had been questioned at every stage, are now the thin line between life and death for 10 men in an aluminum tube. The Tuskegee Airmen did more than escort bombers. They escorted a country, often unwillingly, toward a future in which its own ideals might apply more broadly. Their presence in the European sky challenged the assumptions written into that 1925 report and into countless smaller acts of exclusion. Their discipline and courage under fire forced comrades to rethink old prejudices. Their insistence on the ground that officers' clubs and training units live up to the regulations written in Washington anticipated the nonviolent protests that would reshape American life in the decades to come. In the end, the image that persists is not a chart of missions, nor a row of medals in a display case, but a flash of red against blue. A line of fighters sliding into place beside heavy bombers, close enough that men in the waist windows can see the pilot's goggles and gloved hands. Engines humming in rough unison, contrails knitting together, they press on toward the target and then turn for home, bound not just by orders and tactics, but by a shared understanding that some jobs leave no room for walking away. The war ends. The bombers are scrapped or turned into transports. The Mustangs are sold for a few $1,000s or relegated to training duties. The men age, raise families, bury friends. But somewhere in the collective memory of World War II, there remains that moment when crews looked out through frost-rimmed plexiglass and saw red tails settling into escort positions. In that moment, a young black pilot from Tuskegee and a young white bombardier from Ohio or Texas or New York were linked by something immediate and fierce: the desire to live through the day. For those bomber crews, the Tuskegee Airmen were not an experiment or a symbol. They were the reason the engines kept turning, the reason the runway back in Italy might come into view again through the haze. Begged for, cheered when they appeared, mourned when they did not. The red-tailed escorts wrote their legacy not only in combat records or presidential citations, but in the simple, grateful breath drawn by a man who had just survived another mission because someone had stayed with him in the sky.